Okay, this is chapter 4 of The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault. Chapter 4, The Old Age of the Clinic. The principle that medical knowledge formed for itself at the very bedside of the patient does not date from the end of the 18th century. Many, if not all, the revolutions in medicine have been carried through in the name of this experience, presented as primary source and constant norm. But what was constantly changing was the very grid according to which this experience was given, was articulated into analyzable elements, and found a discursive formulation. Not only the names of diseases, not only the grouping of systems were not the same, but the fundamental perceptual codes that were applied to patients' bodies, the field of objects to which observation addressed itself, these surfaces and depths traversed by the doctor's gaze. The whole system of orientation of this gaze also varied. Medicine had tended since the 18th century to recount its own history as if the patient's bedside had always been a place of constant, stable experience, in contrast to theories and systems which had been in perpetual change and masked beneath their speculation the purity of clinical evidence. The theoretical, it was thought, was the element of perpetual change, the starting point of all the historical variations in medical knowledge, the locus of conflicts and disappearances. It was in this theoretical element that medical knowledge marked its fragile relativity. The clinic, on the other hand, was thought to be the element of its positive accumulation. It was this constant gaze upon the patient, this age-old yet never ever renewed attention that enabled medicine not to disappear entirely with each new speculation, but to preserve itself, to assume little by little the figure of a truth that is definitive, if not completed, in short, to develop below the level of the noisy episodes of its history in a continuous historicity, in the non-variable of the clinic. Medicine, it was thought, had bound truth and time together. Here. Hence, all those somewhat mythical accounts by which, at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, the history of medicine was put together. It is in the clinic, it was said, that medicine found its possibility of origin. At the dawn of mankind, prior to every vain belief, every system, medicine in its entirety consisted of an immediate relationship between sickness and that which alleviated it. This relationship was one of instinct and sensibility rather than of experience. It was established by the individual from himself to himself before it was caught up in a social network. The patient's sensibility tells him whether this or that position makes him more comfortable or torments him. It is this relationship, established without the mediation of knowledge, that is observed by the healthy man. And this observation itself is not an option for future knowledge. It is not even an act of awareness. It is performed immediately and blindly. A secret voice tells us here, contemplate nature, multiplied by itself, transmitted from one to another. It becomes a general form of consciousness, of which each individual is both subject and object. Everyone, without distinction, practiced this medicine. Each person's experiences were communicated to others, and this knowledge passed from father to children. Before it became a corpus of knowledge, the clinic was a universal relationship of mankind with itself. The age of absolute happiness for medicine. And the decline began when writing and secrecy were introduced. That is, the concentration of this knowledge in a privileged group and the dissociation of the immediate relationship, which had neither obstacle nor limits between gaze and speech. Okay, I'm not sure this is the best translation that would be the most ideal, but it's the one that I have right now. So we'll continue reading this in the English translation there. What was known was no longer communicated to others and put to practical use once it had passed through the esotericism of knowledge. No doubt, medical experience remained open for a long time and succeeded in striking a balance between seeing and knowing, le voir et le savoir, that protected it from error. In far-off times, the art of medicine was taught in the presence of its object, and young men learned medical science at the patient's bedside. The patients were often accommodated in the doctor's own house, and the pupils accompanied their masters at all hours on the rounds of their patients. Hippocrates seemed to be both the last witness and most ambiguous representative of this balance. 5th century Greek medicine would seem to be no more than the codification of this universal yet immediate clinical medicine. It formed the first total consciousness of this clinical medicine, and in this sense it seems to be as pure and simple as that first experience, but insofar as it organizes it into a systematic corpus in order to facilitate and shorten the study of it, a new dimension is introduced into medical experience, that of a corpus of knowledge that can be said to be, quite literally, blind, since it has no gaze. This unseeing knowledge is at the source of illusion. A medicine haunted by metaphysics becomes possible. When Hippocrates had reduced medicine to a system, observation was abandoned and philosophy was introduced into medicine. Such is the occultation that has made possible the long history of systems. With the multiplicity of different sects opposing and contradicting one another. A history, therefore, that negates itself, preserving from time only its destructive mark. But beneath that destructive history lies another history, one more faithful to time because closer to its original truth. Into this history is imperceptibly gathered the silent life of the clinic. It remains beneath all speculative theories, keeping medical practice in contact with the world of perception and opening it up to the immediate landscape of truth. There have always been doctors who, with the help of that analysis that comes so naturally to the human mind, having deduced from the patient's appearance all the data needed concerning his idiosyncrasy, have been content simply to study the symptoms. Immobile, but always close to things, the clinic gives medicine its true historical movement. It effaces systems, while the experience that contradicts them accumulates its truth. Thus, a fruitful continuity is found that guarantees to pathology the uninterrupted uniformity of that science throughout the centuries. Over and against systems which belong to negating time, the clinic is the positive time of knowledge. It is not to be invented, therefore, but to be rediscovered. It was already there with the first forms of medicine. It has constituted its full plenitude. It is enough, therefore, to deny that which denies it, to destroy that which in relation to it is nothingness, that is, the prestige of systems, and to leave it at last to enjoy its full rights. Medicine would then be on a level with its truth. This ideal account, which is to be found so frequently at the end of the 18th century, must be understood in relation to the recent establishment of clinical institutions and methods. It presented them as the restitution of an eternal truth in a continuous historical development in which events alone have been of a negative order. Oblivion, illusion, concealment. In fact, this way of rewriting history itself evaded a much truer but much more complex history. It masked that other history by assimilating to clinical method all study of cases, in the old sense of the word, and therefore it authorized all subsequent simplifications whereby clinical medicine became simply the examination of an individual. In order to understand the meaning and structure of clinical experience, we must first rewrite the history of the institutions in which its organizational effort has been manifested. Up to the last years of the 18th century, this history, as a chronological succession, is extremely thin. In 1658, François de Laboe opened a clinical school in the hospital at Leyden. He published the resulting observations under the title of Collegium Nosocomium. The most illustrious of his successors was Boerhaave. It is also possible that there was a chair of clinical medicine at Padua from the end of the 16th century. In any case, it was at Leyden that the practice began, with Boerhaave and his pupils in the 18th century of setting up chairs or institutes of clinical medicine. In 1720, some of Boerhaave's pupils reformed the University of Edinburgh and set up a teaching hospital on the Leyden model. Their example was followed in London, Oxford, Cambridge, and Dublin. In 1733, Van Swieten was asked to submit plans for the establishment of a clinic at the Hospital of Vienna. The first holder of the chair was De Hayen, a pupil of Boerhaave's, and he was succeeded first by Stoll, then by Hildenbrand. This example was followed at Göttingen, where Brendel, Vogel, Baldinger, and J.P. Frank taught in turn. At Padua, a number of hospital beds were devoted to clinical medicine, with Nips as professor. Tissot, who was appointed to set up a clinic at Pavia, explained the broad outlines of his plans in his inaugural lecture on 26 November 1781. About 1770, Le Cassin, Boru, Guilbert, and Colombier had wanted to organize privately and at their own expense a small 12-bed hospital for acute cases in which the doctors would combine the teaching of practical medicine with the treatment of the patients. But the project failed. The faculty and the medical profession in general were too concerned to maintain the old state of affairs whereby practical teaching was given individually, privately, and with great expense of time and money by the more celebrated consultants. It was in the military hospitals that clinical teaching was first organized. The Règlement pour les hôpitaux, drawn up in 1775, states in its Article 13 that each year of study must include a course of practical and clinical medicine of the principal diseases to be found among the troops in the armies and garrisons. And Cabinis quotes as an example the clinic attached to the Naval Hospital at Brest, founded by Dubreuil under the auspices of the Maréchal de Castries. To conclude, one might mention the setting up of a maternity clinic in Copenhagen in 1787. Such, it seems, are the facts. In order to understand their meaning and disentangle the problems that they pose, one must first re-examine a number of observations that should diminish their importance. The examination of cases, the writing up of detailed accounts of them, and their relationship with a possible explanation belong to an essential tradition that has never been in question in medical experience. The organization of the clinic is not correlative with the discovery of the individual fact in medicine. The innumerable collections of cases published since the Renaissance is proof enough of this. Furthermore, there was also a very wide recognition of the need for teaching through practice itself. Hospital visits by apprentice doctors was now widespread, and some of these apprentice doctors would complete their training in a hospital in which they lived and practiced under the supervision of a doctor. What, therefore, was so new and so important about those clinical establishments that the 18th century, especially towards its close, valued so highly? In what respect could this proto-clinic be distinguished from the spontaneous practice that had once been synonymous with medicine, on the one hand, and the clinic as it was later to become organized into a complex, coherent corpus, combining a form of experience, a method of analysis, and a type of teaching on the other? Can it be attributed to a specific structure that might be regarded as peculiar to the 18th century medical experience with which it is contemporary? Number one, this proto-clinic is more than a successive, collective study of cases. It must gather together and make perceptible the organized corpus of nosology. The clinic, therefore, could be neither open to all, as a doctor's daily practice can be, nor specialized, as it was to become in the 19th century. It was neither the enclosed domain of what one has chosen to study, nor the open statistical field of what one cannot but receive. It is enclosed upon the didactic totality of an ideal experience. Its task is not to indicate individual cases with their dramatic points and their particular characteristics, but to manifest the complete circle of diseases. The Edinburgh Clinic was for long a model of its kind. It was organized in such a way that those cases that seem most instructive could be brought together before being a meeting of patient and doctor, a truth to be deciphered, and an ignorance. And in order to be such a meeting, the clinic must form, constitutionally, a structured nosological field. Its contact with the hospital was of a special kind. It was not the direct expression of the hospital, since a principle of choice serves as a selective limit between them. This selection is not simply quantitative, though, according to Tissot, the number of beds should not exceed 30. It is not only qualitative, though it tends to prefer those cases that have a high instructive value. By operating a process of selection, it alters in its very nature the way in which the disease is manifested, and the relationship between the disease and the patient. In the hospital, one is dealing with individuals who happen to be suffering from one disease or another. The role of the hospital doctor is to discover the disease in the patient. And this interiority of the disease means that it is often buried in the patient, concealed within him like a cryptogram. In the clinic, on the other hand, one is dealing with diseases that happen to be afflicting this or that patient. What is present is the disease itself in the body that is appropriate to it, which is not that of the patient, but that of its truth. It is the different diseases that serve as the text. The patient is only that through which the text can be read, in what is sometimes a complicated and confusing state. In the hospital, the patient is the subject of his disease. That is, he is a case. In the clinic, where one is dealing only with examples, the patient is the accident of his disease, the transitory object that it happens to have seized upon. Number 3, the clinic knows its truth, therefore, only in its synthetic form. It is already completely given in that form, and its manifestations are no more than its consequences. In this form of teaching, the pupil may well not possess the key from the outset. Tissot is in favor of making him look for it for a long time. He suggests that each patient in the clinic should be entrusted to 2 students. They and they alone would examine him with decency and gentleness, and with that kindness that is so consoling for those poor unfortunates. They would begin by questioning him as to his country of origin, the constitutions that are common there, his profession, his previous illnesses, the way in which his present illness began, the remedies already taken. They would investigate his vital functions, breathing, pulse, temperature. his natural functions, senses, faculties, sleep, pain. They would also have to palpate the abdomen in order to ascertain the state of his viscera. But what are they looking for, and what hermeneutic principle should guide them in their examination? What are the relations set up between the phenomena observed, the antecedents ascertained, the disorders and deficiencies noted? Nothing more than will be enabled one to name the disease. Once the designation has been carried out, it will be an easy matter to deduce the causes, the prognosis, and the indications by asking oneself, what is wrong with this patient? What is to be put right? Compared with later methods of examination, that recommended by Tissot is hardly less meticulous. Apart from a few details, the difference between this investigation and the clinical examination lies in the fact that in the former, no inventory of a sick organism is made. One retains those elements that enable one to put one's hand on an ideal key. A key that has 4 functions, since it is a mode of designation, a principle of coherence, a law of evolution, and a body of precepts. In other words, the gaze that traverses a sick body attains the truth that it seeks only by passing through the dogmatic stage of the name, in which a double truth is contained: the hidden but already present truth of the disease, and the enclosed truth that is clearly deducible from the outcome and from the means. So it is not the gaze itself that has the power of analysis and synthesis, but the synthetic truth of language, which is added from the outset as a reward for the vigilant gaze of the students. In this clinical method, in which the density of the perceived hides only the imperious and laconic truth that names, it is a question not of an examination, but of a deciphering. So it is understandable, number 4, so it is understandable that the clinic should have had only one direction, from top to bottom, from constituted knowledge to ignorance. In the 18th century, there were only teaching clinics, though only in a limited form, since it was not conceded that the doctor should be able by this method at any moment to read the truth that nature had deposited in the illness. The clinic was concerned only with the instruction, in the narrow sense of the word, that is given by a master to his pupils. It was not in itself an experience, but a condensed version for the use of others of previous experience. The professor indicates to his pupils the order in which objects must be observed in order to be seen and remembered more easily. In no sense was the clinic to discover by means of the gaze. It merely duplicated the art of demonstrating by showing. This was how Dassault understood the lessons of clinical surgery that he gave at the Hotel Dieu from 1781 onwards. Under the eyes of his listeners, he brought in the most seriously sick patients, classified their disease, analyzed its features, outlined the action that was to be taken, carried out the necessary operations, gave an account of his methods and the reasons for them, explained each day the changes that had occurred, and then presented the state of the cured patients, or demonstrated on the lifeless body the alterations that had rendered further exercise of his art useless. The example of Dassault shows, number 5, however, that this speech, parole didactic in essence as it may be, accepted in spite of everything the judgment and risk of the future. In the 18th century, the clinic was not a structure of medical experience, but it was experience at least in the sense that it was a test of knowledge that time must confirm, a test of prescriptions that will be proved right or wrong by the outcome before the spontaneous jury of students. There is a sort of contest before witnesses with the disease, which has its own word to say, and which, despite the dogmatic speech used to designate it, possesses its own language. Thus, the lesson given by the master may turn against him, and provide, despite his vain language, a lesson that belongs to nature itself. Cabanis explains the lesson to be drawn from a bad lesson in this way. If the professor makes a mistake, his failures are soon unmasked by nature, whose language can be neither stifled nor altered. They may even prove to be more useful than his successes and render more ineffective images which might otherwise have made only a slight impression on them. It is when the master's designation fails, therefore, and when time has proved its worthlessness, that the movement of nature is recognized for itself. The language of knowledge remains silent, and one observes. This test showed great honesty, for it was linked to its proper stake, according to a sort of contract renewed daily. At the Edinburgh Clinic, the students kept a record of the diagnosis made, of the state of the patient at every visit, and of the medicines taken during the day. Tissot, who also recommended the keeping of a diary, adds in his report to Count Firmian, in which he describes the ideal clinic, that these diaries should be published each year. Finally, in fatal cases, dissection must provide a last confirmation. Thus, the synthetic designating speech of knowledge is confronted by the audible language of nature in a chronicle of observations that form a mixed syntax, a sort of neutral, arbitrary language. But, in fact, the 18th century failed to give this language a status, a coherent grammar. It was not yet a scientific language, but only a gaming language. Okay, un langage de jeu. Okay, truth did not find its original formulation in that language. It ran the risk, according to the play of chance or skill, of winning or losing. In the 18th century, then, the clinic was already a much more complex form than a mere knowledge of cases, and yet it did not prove to be of great value in the actual movement of scientific knowledge. It formed a marginal structure that was articulated upon the hospital field without having the same configuration. It was intended as a means of teaching medical practice, which it symbolized rather than analyzed. It grouped all experience around the play of a verbal unmasking that was not simply its form of transmission, theatrically retarded. But in a few years, the last years of the century, the clinic was to undergo a sudden, radical restructuring, detached from the theoretical context in which it was born. It was to be given a field of application that was no longer confined to that in which knowledge was said, but which was coextensive with that in which it was born, to put to the test, and fulfilled itself. It was to be identified with the whole of medical experience. For this, it had to be armed with new powers, detached from the language on the basis of which it had been offered as a lesson, and freed for the movement of discovery. Okay, there's the end of chapter 4 of The Birth of the Clinic.